Hi, I'm Claire Sibthorpe. I'm the director of the GSMA Connected Women program.
And Claire, you've recently done a study looking at gender and mobile. In broad terms, what's the global gender gap in terms of mobile ownership and use?
So there's sort of two different gaps. So first of all, there's a lot of, despite people saying that everybody has a mobile phone, that's not true. There's 1.7 billion women in the world who don't have phones, and there are more women than men that don't. There are 200 million women, fewer women than men have phones. So that gap is big. That's just in mobile phone ownership.
Yeah, so that's an ownership gap.
That's the ownership gap. So not everybody has a phone. And then when you look at the usage of the phones, then the gap gets it looks like it's getting even wider. So women are mainly using it for basic phone calls. And when you look at some of the more sophisticated services like mobile internet, mobile money, there's quite a big, again, gap in terms of usage between men and women. So there's like different types of gaps that are important to be aware of.
And how does Africa compare to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we looked at low and middle income countries, and globally we found that women were 14% less likely than men to own a phone. So in Africa it's 13%, so that looks like it's sort of decent. Yeah. But I think the problem with these global averages is that they really hide disparities between countries. So even in Africa, with that number, you have countries like Niger, who has women are 45% less likely to men on a phone, whereas Kenya is 7%. So even it's
a big place.
It's a big place, and there's a lot of differences, and it's not just differences between countries, it's also within countries. Like, so for example, if you look at Mexico, which I know is not in Africa, but if you look at the urban populations, our study showed that the women were 2% less likely than men to own a phone, but when you went to rural area, it went to 26%. So I think the sort of message I would say is that it's really contextual, and it differs depending on location and the context you're in. So
the report says the gender gap is driven by, to quote the report, a complex set of socioeconomic and cultural barriers. I'd just unpick some of that complexity for me.
Sure. So I think the access and usage gap, women are disproportionately affected by it because of some of the societal differences between men and women. So women, so if you look at a couple of our barriers, a number one barrier reported by women was cost. Women tend to earn less income than men. Digital literacy was another barrier. Women often have less access to education than men. So there's societal differences that then make women feel these issues more acutely than men do. And then there's also some kind of cultural things around women's ability to. So if you look at some of the studies countries we looked at, even a woman's choice of whether they could buy the phone, the decision making around phone ownership and SIM is different. So in some countries, even when women had their own money, they had to get permission from men to use it to buy phones. There's issues around in some countries, men feeling concerned with women having phones because it might promote extramarital affairs and such things like that. So there's a lot of cultural and social issues that impact on usage.
And how do you think those affect African women?
Well, I think those gender disparities across all these areas are equally in Africa. If you look at things like income, education, and some of these more cultural effects. So some of our countries, I think Niger was a country where there was, we asked the question, as just an example, we asked the question, is it acceptable or appropriate for a man to check women's numbers the women dialed on a phone? And there was a high percentage that felt it was yes, it was absolutely acceptable. So those sort of issues are not are across the kind of countries we looked at.
And fewer women use services other than voice. Give me some African examples and explain why.
Yeah. So if you look at so what we found was in terms of if you look at women who actually own a phone, in terms of phone calls and SMS, there wasn't a great, in most of the countries we looked at, a great difference. But when you looked at things like mobile internet, things like social media around Facebook, then you do see larger gaps. So, I mean, if you wanted if you look at, for example, I think it was in Kenya, there's quite a gap when you men who are using Facebook versus women. So as you kind of go up in the more sophisticated services, those gaps grow, and I think there's a number of factors to it. So women tend to have less the types of handsets they have, more basic handsets. The cost of data, it costs more, so cost is a factor. Technical literacy is also a barrier to some of these services. So because women are experiencing these barriers more acutely, they play out as you go up into more sophisticated services in a more acute way as well.
Yeah. But has Facebook, in a sense, enfranchised women more in terms of mobile phone usage and the internet, in the sense that Facebook is, in gendered terms, is much more widely used than perhaps other kinds of applications?
Well, again, I mean, I think we didn't specifically look at that, so I think more research is needed, but there was what we did pick up in our study was, for example, less women than men are using it. There are in some countries concerns of men of their women putting pictures of themselves or using it as a tool because of some of the cultural issues. So people, even women feeling concerned about putting their own pictures up and being misused, men getting concerned that women go on these tools and that use it to kind of for these extramarital affairs, things like that. So I think I think there are these sort of gender issues that come to play even in, on a tool that's fairly widely used. But if you look at Facebook specifically in our report, we have asked the question who's using, and there is a gap between men and women using it.
Yeah, still.
So yeah.
Okay. Finally, what are the strategies for closing the gender gap?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think we need more data. So this was a very large study. We did 11 countries, and there isn't very much data out there that's gender disaggregated on this issue. So I think there needs to be more systematic collection and reporting on the issue and the data, so we understand it more and understand it in a more nuanced way in some areas that we weren't able to cover in detail in the report. I think there is a need for, if you look at sort of mobile operators, to do more consumer insights research to understand the female segment and what their wants and needs are and how to target it, from policymakers and regulators to kind of address issues like taxation and some of the policy regulatory issues that are barriers to cost, and also network quality and coverage came out as our second highest reported barrier. So there's a range of actions, and it's outlined in our report that can be taken. So I think to address this, there's no silver bullet. There's no one actor that can address it. It needs to be a kind of coordinated approach across actors tackling a range of issues, and including some of the more broader societal issues around women's access to education and income and those things. So I think it's there's no one answer, but it needs focused attention by different stakeholders.
But not only is there an individual case for addressing this gap, but there's also a commercial case in a sense, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Operators should pay attention to this.
Yeah. So again, in our study, we looked at if you just closed the gap around access and ownership. So usage. So just getting women on par with men in terms of their usage and ownership, it's a $170 billion opportunity for operators, in addition to the sort of bigger societal and economic gains that you get from kind of closing these gender gaps. So it is an opportunity.